Hello, I'm Ella and I'm the art technician for the Worcester campus for the art and design course, and today we're going to look at how to screen print a basic stencil design onto paper. Okay, so the first thing is preparing your stencil. There's just a couple of things to bear in mind for this. It will be completely dependent on the design you're choosing, is what you're cutting your design onto. You want to make sure that you're using something that's card-based. If you try cutting the design onto a piece of printer paper or just any thin paper, when we come to printing and the paint goes through, it will saturate the paper, and because it's so thin, it could rip, especially if you have finer details, it could rip the paper when printing. So when you're making your stencil, make sure that you have a nice thick cardstock that you'll be cutting into. Other things to think about when making a stencil is elements that, how they're going to be cut away. So say for instance, I've gone O there. If I wanted to keep the center in, you have to think about making those cuts to secure everything on, because obviously anything you cut away, it will just take the whole design out. So it's about forward planning that. I recommend with any design you're doing is drawing it first on paper and use tracing paper to transfer it onto the card. Always make sure you're using a fresh blade on your craft knife. If you use a blunt blade, it won't go through the card, which can cause tears, which will make your image print not in a nice clean design. It will be a bit fuzzy and also can lead to injury. So you just need to make sure that you're using a fresh blade, thick card, pre-plan your design, and then you'll be ready to do your one-colour screen print. So we need to make the ink for printing now. Printing onto paper with screen print, we actually use acrylic paint as the ink, but we need to mix this with what's called an acrylic printing medium. So this basically is going to stop the acrylic from drying quickly, which won't damage your screen when you're trying to wash it out, because it can do that. So it will dry, it will keep the acrylic nice and wet, and also it makes it more translucent. So if you were to do 2, 3, 4 colour prints, when you're layering those colours on top of each other, say if you had a blue ink and a yellow ink, then it'll have a nice green where the images overlap. So that's why we use this printing medium. The other thing to think about is what quality of ink you're using, quality paint. So this is probably the most used. It's a System 3 textile medium. They make specific System 3 paints. These bind really nicely with the medium, so it'll give you a nicer finish. But if you're on a budget, it's also absolutely fine to use just any acrylic paint. You just need to be aware that the quality of the paint is going to affect the quality of the print. I am actually going to use the blue because it would be nice to have a nice dark design. It's the colour I want, and it still mixes fine. So what you need to do is use your paint first. You need to mix this to be roughly a 50-50 mix of paint to medium. If you want it to be slightly more translucent, I'd recommend 60-40. I'm just going to measure out. So that should probably do it. Depends how many prints you're doing. It does stretch a long way, you'd be surprised. So now I just need to top this up. I recommend doing the paint first, because otherwise you could put a certain amount of medium in, but find that you haven't mixed your colour correctly, keep adding paint, and you just lose the amount. This way you're definitely going to make it 50-50, because you've seen how much paint you've used. So I'm just going to go on top of that. Cool. That might be roughly more 60-40, it's fine. You want to have more medium than you do paint. And this, it doesn't take any of the pigment away, so it's not going to change the quality of the ink or anything like that, and the colour that comes through. It literally will just keep it nice and wet and make sure that it'll overlap with other colours nicely if you need it to. So, about to start printing, make sure you're wearing an apron. Acrylic paint is a nightmare to get out of clothes, so you don't want that. So it's good to just wear an apron. So I've got my paint ready, I've got my stencil ready. I now need to get this onto my screen. So I'm using an A4 size screen. Screens come in various sizes of the mesh count, which is the silk, but that's sort of dependent on whether you're doing textiles and acrylics. So I've got one for acrylic painting today. So the main thing is I've got text on my stencil. When we're printing, we print this side down, and that's where the image will come through. So I basically, when I tape this on, I need to make sure that it's taped on what looks like backwards to me, but when flipped, the ink will go through this way onto the paper, so the text will be the right way around. So it's just making sure with your image, when you put it on initially, you're actually going to need to tape it on back to front, and then it will transfer correctly onto the paper. Exactly the same as if you were exposing it using acetate and doing it through light, which is another way to put an image onto a screen. Same thing as a stencil. It's just making sure you are reversing the image before you put it on. So for this, you just need some masking tape. And what we're going to do is we're just going to tape it on, but also, if you can see, I'm taping where this is still exposed. So anywhere where you can see the screen through, when we put our paint on it, it can come through here. So I'm masking the stencil on, but I'm also masking out any design that's exposed that I don't want to print, because the ink will go through anything that hasn't been taped off, just how the stencil works. So you don't need too much, don't need to go too heavy with it. Masking tape's nice as well, because when you go to clean your screen, if you get some water on it, it comes off quite nicely, rather than using something like parcel tape, which could damage the screen when you're removing it on cleaning. So if I get my last piece on here, great, my stencil is attached and ready for print. Okay, so now I'm ready to choose my paper and I'm ready to print. This is a very, very thin paper. I wouldn't recommend this for printing, and I'll show you why. The ink will probably make it buckle slightly and warp the paper because it's not thick enough to hold that amount of ink and liquid. This is sort of a medium paper stock. You get this in regular sketchbooks. So we'll give this one a try. And this is actually a textured watercolour paper, which is a lot thicker. You can tell your paper thickness. It's called GSM, which is grams per square metre. And that is, yeah, it will determine how thick the paper is basically, and you can get textured, non-textured. All depends on the print finish that you want to achieve. Right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to tape my paper on so it's not going to move. It only needs a little bit at the top here. Cool, so I've got that taped on. Take a bit more time with it, make sure that it's all lined up nice and neatly. I've got my screen ready, I've got my stencil ready. So I'm going to position this where I'd like to have it on the paper. That looks all right for me. Right, so now it's just a case of getting the ink on, running the squeegee through, and seeing how this turns out. So you want to use literally just a spoon. No high-tech equipment for this. So you can see there, one important thing which I always recommend to students is don't put your ink right to the edge of your frame, because it will get really messy. When you use your squeegee, it will go up against here. You'll pick up your screen to move it off the paper. You'll get paint on your hands. You'll transfer that onto your print, and all the hard work's sort of been ruined a bit. So what I'd like to do is I'm going to get, this is called my squeegee. Make sure it fits your screen, fits your design well. So I'm just making sure I've got plenty of ink. And lightly first, I'm going to take a tiny bit, and I'm not going to press down. I'm just going to flood over. So I'm just flooding, making sure there's some ink, pressing it off, and then I'm going to give it a nice quick pull. What I'm going to do now is I've got some scrap paper to put my squeegee on, so I'm not getting paint on my bench. I'm going to pull this up. Okay, so when you're printing again as well, tap off some of your ink because you're going to have excess on the squeegee. You can pull this through. So, nice swift pull. I'm going to bring it back up and over again. Here we go. So you can see where the screen's bled a little bit. That's from moving it. but that will give you a nice clean stencil and how to screen print with a stencil. Right, so once you've got some prints, you can get as many as you want out of it. You just need to clean your screen. Very, very, very important. It's acrylic. Despite the medium, it will dry on your screen eventually. If the paint dries on, there's no sort of coming back from it. You can use chemicals, but it can damage the screen. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to scrape the excess paint that I've got rather than it going down the sink. And also it saves it if you were to use this colour again for another print. You'll need to clean your squeegee, you need to clean the spoon, but the most important thing is to get this screen in the water as quickly as you can. So you could use a pressure washer, you can just use a tap, you can use a sponge, whatever you're more comfortable with. Pressure washer will do it quicker. But the first thing is just wetting your screen. So the paint can't dry on this now. So I've got that on there. What I now need to do is I need to make sure I take off this masking tape. Very important, because as you can see, the paint bleeds underneath. So if you were to clean the screen but leave the masking tape on, when you dry it, the paint will dry with the screen. You might as well be able to salvage your stencil. Probably not. It's got lots of paint. If you're desperate to, you could put it on a drying rack. Not something I'd really recommend that. So that will just get popped in the bin for me, because that's why it's quite good to have the design traced so you can recut it if you need to. And then you're going to go over this side. You can see it's taking it off already. For any bits that are really stubborn, it's fine to just use a sponge and just make sure that you're being nice and light with it. So I'm going over one side, I'm flipping that, making sure I'm getting it off the frame, off all areas, and you're just going to repeat this process until your screen is nice and clean. Make sure you get this somewhere to dry. If you have a heated drying rack, fantastic. If you don't, not the end of the world. That's my nice clean screen.